All right, Ninja Nerds, so we're going to talk about the kidney today. So if you look here, we have the kidney's kidney bean shaped, and we have two of them, right? So you'd have them in the abdominal actual area, right? So the abdominal cavity. So if you look here, you're going to see this like nice little connective tissue that's actually surrounding the kidney. There's actually three layers, but we're going to talk about this one first. This is actually called the renal capsule. It's made up of a little bit of like a loose connective tissue, and basically its job is to prevent certain types of infectious microorganisms from spreading into the kidney. Now, just for your information, there is other connective tissue surrounding it, like outside of this one, so more superficial to this one, which is called the perirenal fat capsule. And that's a adipose tissue that surrounds it and also is helpful for being able to cushion the actual kidneys. And there's also one more, is actually what's called the renal fascia, which is like a dense fibrous irregular connective tissue that anchors it to the actual surrounding structures to keep it retroperitoneal, which means behind the peritoneum. All right, if you look here at the kidney, you can't see it, but imagine there's like a slit-like space. So a little hole here where, example, the renal artery is going in, the renal vein is coming out, and the ureter is coming out. There's a little slit-like space where all these structures are going in and out. That's called the renal hilus, okay? That's very different from what's called the renal sinus. The renal sinus is in this area. It's basically like the plumbing of the kidney. It's like this area or this space which consists of like the renal pelvis, the renal artery, the renal veins, and other different structures in this area, okay? Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and look at different parts of the kidney here. So if you look here, this is actually going to be this outer granulated tissue out here, all this like kind of like a beigeish color here, all this part here too. All the way around is actually called the cortex. So it's called the renal cortex, okay? Deep in the actual part of the kidney is this nice little like dark striated types of tissue. That is actually called the renal medulla. And if you kind of look at the renal medulla, it kind of appears to look like a pyramid, right? So that's like a renal pyramid, a renal pyramid, a renal pyramid, and a renal pyramid. And they just keep going down. So again, renal medulla is this dark striated color, and then they look like pyramids. So you call these renal pyramids, okay? Next thing, you notice number 23 right here? It's like an inward extension of the cortical tissue. So if you notice, here's the cortex, and then there's a little extension that dips down into the medulla. These are called the renal columns, okay? So that's called the renal column. So the renal columns are inward extensions of the cortex, all right? So there's another example of a renal column, and then over here is also a renal column. All right, next thing, if you look at the end here, the end of this renal pyramid that we said, right? So this is the renal pyramid, right? A part of the renal medulla. The end of the renal pyramid, all the way down at the bottom, that's right there, that end part number 6 is called the renal papilla. Okay, so that's called the renal papilla. The renal papilla empties the actual urine into this little like tube here. You see this little tube right there, guys? That's called the minor calyx. So every renal papilla empties the urine off, like for example, this is a minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx right there. But what happens is when multiple minor calyx actually come together, they form a major calyx. So look right here, minor calyx, minor calyx. These guys will actually join together. There's a minor calyx and a minor calyx. They'll come together and form this big structure here, which is called the major calyx, okay? The major calyx will actually join and actually form this big structure here, which is called the renal pelvis, number 4. So it's the big joined structure of multiple major calyx. And again, that forms the actual renal pelvis. And then once the renal pelvis exits the kidney and goes out through the hilus, it becomes this big structure here, number 3, which is called the ureter, okay? So again, one more time, minor calyx. And then all of this, whenever you have a minor calyx joined together, they form a major. And again, over here, minors would actually join together to form a major. And all of those major calyces empty into what's called the renal pelvis, and the renal pelvis exits the actual ureter exits the kidney as the ureter. All right. Another thing, we need to talk about the arteries, the blood flow to the actual kidney. So let's go ahead and follow a drop of blood from what's called the abdominal aorta and into the kidney. So imagine there's the abdominal aorta here. Off of the abdominal aorta, you have an artery, number 2. That number 2 is called the renal artery. Okay, so it's the renal artery. The renal artery, once it enters into the kidney through the hilus, it splits. You see how it splits here into 2A? 2A is called the segmental arteries. So again, 2 is renal, 2A is segmental. Then the segmental artery goes into what's called the interlobar artery, number 13. Now, if I tell you what a lobe is, that's going to help you to really understand what number 13 is. So a lobe of the kidney, because you have multiple lobes of the kidney, let's say I call what's called a renal, like a lobe. I'm going to actually take and cut around this renal pyramid all the way up. So from this part of the renal pyramid all the way up, and the surrounding cortex. So all the way up here, all the way over here, and down this way, right there. So all this that I kind of like chunked out here, all this point here, that's all a lobe of the kidney. So we define a lobe as the renal pyramid and the surrounding cortical tissue. This artery here is called the interlobar artery. So if this is a lobe of the kidney and this is a lobe of the kidney, the interlobar artery runs in between those two. It's the interlobar artery. The interlobar artery is actually going to move up through the actual lobes, and then as it gets to the top part of the cortex, it starts branching off. So you see number 16 here, and you would also see again, here's interlobar artery coming up this way and branching this way. This branch and this branch is called the arcuate artery. So number 16 is the arcuate artery. Then, the arcuate artery, as it's moving up, it gives off these branches. You see these little branches coming off here? All this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, that red one there. These ones that are actually getting radiated up into the cortex is called the cortical radiate artery. So this is the cortical radiate artery, cortical radiate artery, cortical radiate artery. Then that cortical radiate artery has what's called an afferent arteriole. It's not very well seen on this model, so I'm going to show you this on another model in just a second. But just for right now, trust me that the cortical radiate artery feeds into what's called an afferent arteriole, then into the glomerulus, and then through the efferent arteriole, and then it comes out of the efferent arteriole, and then it goes into what's called the peritubular capillaries. From the peritubular capillaries, it comes down through what's called the cortical radiate vein. So you see this vein right there, guys? Right next to the cortical radiate artery? That's called the cortical radiate vein. The cortical radiate vein then actually moves back down. So look, it actually comes here, and as it moves, it joins with the arcuate vein. So you have cortical radiate vein, arcuate vein, and then look what happens. I'll show you this way too. So again, cortical radiate vein joins with the arcuate vein and empties into what's called the interlobar vein. Okay, so that interlobar vein there. Then the interlobar vein joins with other interlobar veins and forms what's called the renal vein. So you see number 1 right there? That's called the renal vein. So again, one more time. Cortical radiate vein joins with the arcuate vein, forms what's called the specifically interlobar vein. The interlobar vein will then actually join with other interlobar veins and form what's called the renal vein. If you notice, there is no segmental veins here. All right? And in the other enlarged, we're going to look at an enlarged lobe with the nephron. We'll be able to see some other structures here that will help us to really understand the actual kidney anatomy. So let's go ahead and move on and look at the actual enlarged lobe of the nephron. All right, guys, so now we're taking a look at like an enlarged view of a kidney lobe, right? So a lobe of the kidney. And again, what was a lobe defined as? It's defined as the renal pyramid, right? And it's surrounding cortical tissue. So this is a lobe here. Now, let's keep going and show you what I couldn't show you before when we got into some of these smaller arteries here. So if you remember this artery right here, kind of I was following it up here. It's actually moving in between the lobes. Remember that one? It's called the interlobar artery. So this is the interlobar artery right here, number 12. So the interlobar artery is moving up, and then as it moves up, it gives off that branch, right, around the actual cortex. It gives off this branch right here. So this branch right here, and then you'd see it over here, right there, all the way over. So number 7, if you will. So following up is interlobar, then it gives off a branch which is called the arcuate artery, okay? Now, what happens is the arcuate artery is going to start feeding up here. So if we feed it up here, you see as it comes up here, number 8, as we follow this all the way up, it's like a branch going straight into the cortex here. This one right here is called the cortical radiate artery, just like this one over here is also the cortical radiate artery. So now, cortical radiate artery here, they give off branches. So you see these tiny little branches right there? We'll even see these even better when we look at what's called a renal corpuscle. But if you see that tiny little guy right there, That is called the afferent arteriole. That little branch right there, that also is an afferent arteriole. And that one right there is an afferent arteriole, just like this one is also, and that one. So 9 is the afferent arteriole. What happens is the afferent arteriole feeds into this little structure here. So you see this little structure here, this little like beige tan looking ball? This is actually called a renal corpuscle. And what a renal corpuscle is made up of, and we'll see it in a better view, is it's made up of a tuft of capillaries, which is called the glomerulus, and then a surrounding Bowman's capsule. But we'll talk about that. For right now, just know that afferent arteriole feeds into this thing called a renal corpuscle. And then what happens is it gets drained by another arteriole. You see this one right there? That's called the efferent arteriole. This one would also be the efferent arteriole. This one over here would be efferent arteriole. So it's going into here, getting filtered through the glomerulus, and coming out through what's called the efferent arteriole number 10, also efferent arteriole, and also efferent arteriole. Okay? So interlobar, arcuate, cortical radiate, afferent, glomerulus, efferent. Now, the efferent arterioles, as they're coming out, they start branching into smaller little capillary networks. You see this whole capillary network right here? This whole capillary network right here is called the peritubular capillaries. Okay? So all this capillary network that the efferent arterioles branch into is called the peritubular capillaries. The peritubular capillaries are important for secretion and absorption. We'll talk about that in physiology. But as we drain the peritubular capillaries, they all drain into this main vein here. You see this number 8 right there? That main vein? That right there is called the cortical radiate vein. So it's bringing the actual blood, the deoxygenated blood, all the way down from the cortex going towards the medulla. Okay? So now this cortical radiate vein is coming down, right? It's going to join with this blue vein right there. What's this one? That's called the arcuate vein. So remember I told you that there was the efferent arteriole that gave off the peritubular capillary branches? Well, there's another peritubular capillary branch that actually it feeds into. So this is the efferent arteriole. This is also an efferent arteriole. You see how it actually gives off this branch right here, this big capillary network here? This big capillary network, it's a peritubular capillary, but it's in the medulla, so we give it a special name. So this big peritubular capillary network here is called the vasa recta. Okay, so again, efferent arteriole gives off a branch that feeds deep down into the medulla here and forms this capillary network. And this capillary network is called the vasa recta. It's very important with being able to form concentrated urine, and we'll talk about that. So again, efferent arteriole, vasa recta. The vasa recta has blood that can also drain into the arcuate vein. So arcuate vein, blood from the vasa recta, and the cortical radiate vein all dump their blood into this main vein moving down the actual in between the lobes. So this main vein coming all the way down here is going to be number 12, is going to be the interlobar vein. Okay? And then if you remember, the interlobar vein will actually feed into the renal vein and then go back to the inferior vena cava. All right, now, let's come back over here to the glomerulus. So if we go back to the glomerulus, that little capillary network inside of the renal, it's a part of the renal corpuscle, inside the Bowman's capsule. If you look here 20, it's a little capillary network. That's called your glomerulus. What the glomerulus does is it filters certain types of plasma components out of the blood and into this little like tubes here, all right? So you see this little membrane here that's kind of surrounding it all the way around? That's called the Bowman's capsule, okay? What happens is once the fluid, the plasma is filtered, it drains into this Bowman's capsule, and then it goes into this little like coiled tube. You see this little coiled tube like this? 2A. That's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay? So this little like thing right here surrounding the glomerulus is the Bowman's capsule, but then this tube that's coiled is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Then the proximal convoluted tubule goes down through what's called the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then through a little thin section of the descending limb. Then it goes down and it comes back up through the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So descending limb, thin section, ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Then as it comes up back into the cortex, look, it starts getting coiled and like convoluted again, right? So it comes up, ascending limb, look, boom, gets coiled again. This little coiled part right here is called the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so one more time, Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, descending limb, thin section, ascending limb, distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule dumps its actual filtrate into this big long structure all the way down here. You see this guy right there? All the way here. This is called the collecting duct. So number 6 is the collecting duct. Now, one more term I want to give you guys is, you know how I said the Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and distal convoluted tubule? That makes up what's called the nephron, okay? So a renal corpuscle is the glomerulus and the actual Bowman's capsule. But a nephron is the Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and again, the distal convoluted tubule, all right? And again, this is the collecting duct. Now, as the filtrate's actually moving down through the collecting duct, it'll get to the end of this actual renal pyramid here. What was that little peg-like projection of the renal pyramid called down here? This is called the renal papilla, right? Well, there's a little duct portion here at the renal papilla. That's called the papillary duct. And once this is actually at the papillary duct, it's now urine. And it drops off of the papillary duct, off the renal papilla, and into that minor calyx, okay? All right, so that covers everything we need to see here on the enlarged lobe with the nephron. Now let's go ahead and zoom in on this actual renal corpuscle and take a deeper look at that. All right, so now we're gonna take a deeper look at the renal corpuscle. So do you guys remember, like this is actually that little larger, like a smaller view of the renal corpuscle. What we're gonna do is we're gonna look at that in a way, way deeper view. So this is a renal corpuscle. So again, what is the definition of a renal corpuscle? It's the glomerular capillaries and the surrounding, it's called Bowman's capsule. So now feeding this glomerular capillaries is this arteriole here called the afferent arteriole. So the afferent arteriole is the arteriole that's feeding the glomerulus. Draining it is number 7 over here. This is the efferent arteriole. Okay, so afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole. Afferent feeds the glomerular capillaries and efferent drains the glomerular capillaries. Okay, another thing. If you look here at the actual afferent arteriole, there's this you see this little structure here? It's like zooming into the inner side of it. In the afferent arteriole, you have what's called these cells called JG cells, or juxtaglomerular cells. These juxtaglomerular cells are like basically pressure receptors. They're baroreceptors and mechanoreceptors, and they can have the ability to sense changes in blood pressure and stretch. When that happens, they have vesicles that they can secrete specific types of chemicals like renin, and renin helps to regulate our blood pressure. Okay, so afferent arteriole, and then there's that's called the juxtaglomerular cells in it. Now, since I'm here, do you see this actual thing in the back here? This is actually called, this is a portion of the distal convoluted tubule. In the distal convoluted tubule, you have these specific cells. They're like chemoreceptors. So they pick up different chemical concentrations. These cells right here are called the macula densa cells. And again, they're actually located in the distal convoluted tubule. And they're basically special chemoreceptors. So what happens is we actually define this whole apparatus. We actually have like an apparatus. Let's say I make a whole circle here around the distal convoluted tubule with the macula densa cells, around this afferent arteriole with the JG cells. This whole thing, if I kind of make a whole circle around this, this is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, and it consists of the JG cells in the afferent arteriole and the macula densa cells in the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is this tuft of capillaries. But if you notice, and it's actually fenestrated capillaries, if you notice, this is actually just the raw capillaries here. But if you notice, there's like this little beige tan covering on it. They're actually having cells like clinging to the capillaries. And this actually forms what's called the visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. And this visceral layer of Bowman's capsule, these little cells, these simple squamous cells, modified simple squamous cells, they're actually called podocytes, which means foot cells. So these little podocytes that are literally clinging onto these glomerular capillaries. And these are forming the visceral layer of the Bowman's capsule. And then this inner layer, this outer layer out here, if you kind of follow it over here too, and just this whole out thing out here, it's actually made up of simple squamous epithelial cells too. But this whole outer layer here, that's even continuous with this actual podocyte visceral layer, this layer right here is called the parietal layer of Bowman's capsule. So one more time, the podocytes make up the visceral layer of the Bowman's capsule, and this outer part here is the parietal layer of Bowman's capsule. All right, Last thing, and we're going to finish this one up, is if you see this Bowman's capsule is actually getting drained by this next structure here. And it's just a small piece of it. You see this, it's like little like simple cuboidal epithelial cells. This is actually going to be very, very important here. This is actually called the proximal convoluted tubule. It processes a lot of different types of nutrients and solutes and small proteins. And we'll talk about that in renal physiology. Okay, so this whole thing is the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, so let's give a quick recap, guys. So again, this is the afferent arteriole. This is consisting of the JG cells, which are again releasing renin that control blood pressure. So they're baroreceptors, right? Then again, you have the efferent arteriole here. Then you have the macula densa cells, which are part of the distal convoluted tubule. They're like chemoreceptors. And then this whole area of the macula densa cells and the JG cells is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. These cells that are clinging to the actual glomerular capillaries is called podocytes. They form the visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. The actual glomerular capillaries are fenestrated capillaries, very porous. And then this outer layer here is called the parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule, okay? And it's also very continuous with the visceral layer. And then we have the proximal convoluted tubule down here, which is going to be very important for absorbing specific types of nutrients and for secretion of like certain types of chemicals. All right, engineers, I hope all of this made sense. I hope it helped. Until next time.